Alright, so this is Decent We the People News. Alright, this video is without prejudice and or without recourse. Okay, not attorney, I'm not going to give legal advice, just maybe my opinion only. So do not take it as legal advice. Alright, this is a learning video, people. Alright, never look straight forward, always look around you, be able to protect yourself by any means necessary. Now, this is kind of interesting brought up, right? So on this video, it's going to be talking about, and he don't specifically say it, but I'm going to say it, all right, how Congress is bypassing responsibility, bringing it upon others that actually does not have standing. Like EPA, all these environmental things, all the I can argue about FBI even, you know, because we're not voting these people in, all right? They're putting people in particular spots to run over you, and Congress is not held responsible for the wrongdoings of these people, and some of these people don't even take an oath of office. Now, how do they have authority over you? Remember, by the maximum law, right? The creator is always going to be responsible, right? So Congress created EPA, then they must be held accountable to EPA's rules and regulations that they make. All right, this is the reason why I said over and over and over, y'all, no more voting for the same people. I don't care if you like them or not. We need to let Congress know their job is not stable. All right? Every single time there's an election, if you guys are voters, elect another one. Okay? Don't matter if it's Democrat or Republicans, they're one and the same in the back doors. All right? How do you think some of these things got passed? Because both of them agreed. All right? How did EPA get passed? Right? Because both of them agreed. And now they're sitting there and they're saying, oh, well, we're not responsible for what they're doing. We just created it, and we're letting them violate your rights. But we're not responsible for it. Well, you're the creators. Yeah, you are. Because of our ignorance, we don't hold them accountable. But let's proceed forward, y'all.
A lot of speculation that this completely destroyed Alexander Hamilton's chances of being president, in part because many believe...
If you want to get a little bit more details of what this gentleman is talking about, he is a senator. You guys know how I feel about these things. But he does bring some interesting things. He's got a book, so look for his book, okay? Senator Mike Lee, okay? All right, let's go.
That's why they put the birthright citizenship requirement in the Constitution, was to prevent Alexander Hamilton from ever becoming president of the United States, specifically because he gave this speech. They didn't trust him. But the reason he gave that speech was because he didn't trust the mob. The reason they rejected that speech was because they didn't trust what a monarch would do. After all, we had just won a revolution against a government headed by a monarch. They saw that as the last thing we wanted at the time. It's one of the reasons why they were so careful at the Constitutional Convention to parse out the different powers of government, to separate them out, and to make sure that those in charge of making the laws would stand accountable at regular intervals to those they represented. It's one of the reasons why we ended up not just with an elected legislative body, but an elected legislative body consisting of two chambers. They wanted to make doubly sure that there was accountability at every level within our lawmaking system. So how's that story relevant today? How does that matter now? In some ways, we've reverted to a system that operates, at least to a significant degree, on the basis of people who are immune from the vote, from the voter, from the American people. Let me explain what I mean. I have two stacks of documents in my office in the Russell Senate Office Building. If you're up there, you're welcome to come see it. I'm in room 361A of the Russell Senate Office Building. Two stacks of documents that illustrate the point that I'm talking about our laws. One stack of documents consists of the laws passed by Congress last year. The people's elected representatives in the House and the Senate agreed, and the President signed them into law It's a few hundred pages of law passed last year. It's only a few inches tall. It's a small stack of documents. The other stack, by comparison, is huge. It's, instead of just a few inches tall, it's 11 feet tall. Instead of a few hundred pages in length, it's 80,000 pages in length. And this second stack of documents consists of last year's Federal Register. Now, for those of you who are blessed sufficiently to not know what the Federal Register is, it's the annual cumulative index of federal regulations as they're released for notice and comment and later as they're finalized. 80,000 pages. Now, these are regulations that are promulgated. Now, I want to make clear, they're promulgated by men and women who are, by and large, very well educated, very well intentioned, very hardworking, and usually have a very high level of expertise. They have a lot to offer. I don't mean to disparage or denigrate in any way the hardworking men and women who work in our federal agencies and who promulgate these rules and regulations. But they have one thing that members of Congress do not and never will. They're not elected. And they therefore don't stand accountable to the voters at regular intervals. Not now, not ever. They're not really even directly accountable to anyone who is in turn elected. This creates a problem. It creates one of the same problems that the Founding Fathers fought so hard against at the Constitutional Convention. One of the problems they were so concerned about was this one. It's interesting. When I was in law school, about 20 years ago, I remember we had a guest speaker who came to speak to us about the growth of the modern regulatory state, the modern federal regulatory state. He explained to us that this regulatory system creates some problems. He may have mentioned the lack of accountability of federal bureaucracies that issue rules carrying the force of generally applicable law. What he focused on most directly, most acutely, was the fact that the federal regulatory system was costing the American economy $300 billion a year. I remember when he said this, there was an audible gasp from the room. $300 billion, that's an enormous amount of money. He went on to explain that this operates kind of like a backdoor invisible tax. Only it's a really regressive backdoor invisible tax, one that tends to afflict the poor and the middle class more than anyone else, even though they may not know it, even though they may not attribute the fact that it costs them money to the existence of the federal largesse in this area. Because these federal regulations make everything the American people buy more expensive. Goods and services that they purchase are made more expensive. The poor and the middle class feel that more acutely. Others may pay for those costs also in terms of diminished wages and the lack of employment opportunities. But he explained that we needed reform. Now, that was 20 years ago. $300 billion a year was shocking at the time. Annual compliance costs, the cost of complying with federal regulations today, is nearly 7 times that. It now stands at about $2 trillion a year. This makes everything the American people buy more expensive. And these are rules.
Now I'm going to stop right there again. This video was back in 2015. 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. 7 years ago, this is when he brought it up at the trillions.
That are put in place by men and women who, however well-intentioned, hardworking, and well-specialized and well-educated they are, don't work for you. They don't report to you. You can't fire them, ever. Now, lest I paint Congress as a victim here, I want to make clear Congress is not a victim. Congress, in fact, is the problem. Congress has created this problem. It has done so under the direction of Republicans and Democrats alike over the last 80 years. And it has done so by passing really broad, vague, amorphous laws. So imagine, for example, if Congress decided that it didn't want to do its job anymore, that members of Congress found political accountability to be so difficult that Congress wanted to just sort of escape any public criticism, and therefore passed one central law that said, we shall have good laws. And we hereby delegate to the herewith created Federal Commission on the Creation of Good Laws the power to make rules carrying the force of generally applicable law, the herewith created commission will also have the authority to enforce and implement. And then Congress says, that's it, we're done. From that moment forward, Congress avoids any accountability for federal law. When people come and say the Federal Commission on the Creation of Good Laws has fined us, has treated us harshly, has come up with these horrible rules, members of Congress would say, oh yes, those barbarians over at that commission, they're just awful, aren't they? Let's talk about our common hatred of the people on the commission. Congress would escape accountability, and of course the commissioners have no accountability because they're not elected. They're not really accountable to anyone who is elected. Now, this may sound like a far-fetched example, but it's not all that far-fetched because it's what Congress does all the time. There are a lot of good legal and regulatory structures that in one form or another probably ought to be in place, but have been put in place the wrong way. Like, for example, the Clean Air Act. Congress, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but it more or less proves the point to say Congress passed a law saying, in effect, we shall have clean air. We hereby delegate to the EPA the task of explaining what clean air is, what pollution is, and then punishing polluters, defining the penalties that will apply. All of those things then belong to EPA. With some regularity, I have constituents coming to me explaining how this or that regulation promulgated by EPA or another agency is harming them. And members of Congress at the end of the day like to complain also about the agencies, never acknowledging that we ourselves are the problem. We ourselves created the problem. Fortunately, here, as with the Fourth Amendment example I pointed to a minute ago, there is a solution. This one hasn't been enacted yet, but it needs to arrive. The solution is actually quite old. It's about as old as the modern federal regulatory state itself. You see, James Landis, the famed law professor who was part of FDR's brain trust, who helped create the modern regulatory administrative state, advised President Roosevelt at the time that a lot of these agencies were first created and this type of lawmaking first became fashionable. He said, in order to really make this work within our constitutional structure, these regulations, the regulations that impose affirmative obligations on the American people, need to be passed into law by Congress. They need to be treated more or less as legislative proposals that once passed by the House and the Senate and signed into law by the President can take effect. Well, Congress, for whatever reason, never adopted that rule. James Landis's advice was overlooked in the 1930s. Congress drifted away from this. Congress left itself a back door by creating what's known as a legislative veto. And initially what were, to begin with, just a few provisions of federal law, over the next few decades became hundreds and hundreds of provisions of federal law, where Congress would say, okay, we give agency X the power to promulgate regulation Y, go do it, but if we don't like regulation Y, Congress can veto that. That became a favorite tool of Congress, and it made it even easier for Congress to rely on the outside rulemaking, outside lawmaking task. And over time, Congress became addicted to these. There was one problem. The Supreme Court came along in 1985 in a case called INS v. Chadha and declared the legislative veto provision unconstitutional, concluding that it violated Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution, which contemplates that any new law has to be passed by the House and passed by the Senate and submitted to the President for signature or for veto, and that the legislative veto provision contemplated an additional loop in the circuit, one that didn't conclude with the President and was therefore unconstitutional. A lot of people thought or speculated or wondered at the time INS v. Chadha was decided whether that would mean perhaps the end of this excessive regulatory lawmaking. That maybe since Congress no longer had the last word, that Congress could no longer veto legislatively any executive branch regulation, that perhaps that would be the end of the party, at least prospectively. Turned out it was not the end. It was not even the beginning of the end. It was only the end of the beginning. Since then,
You get the point. Okay? EPA, like he says, Railroad Commission, your Social Security, the IRS. All these people are their own agencies, separate. And somehow or another, they got magic powers to control you and tell you what you can and cannot do. And Congress are sitting in the back doors. Well, don't hold me responsible. Don't fire me. Yeah, people, we need to actually start replacing them every single election. If you're a Republican, there is another Republican running. Vote for the other Republicans. We cannot have them stay in office. And maybe we can get this back in line. Once again, all these things that Congress came up with, just a swipe of a pen can wipe them back out. Just saying, y'all. And if I'm not mistaken, again, this is my opinion only. All right, I'm not an attorney. I think in a lot of these things, even the president could do a swipe of the pen. I know the CIA, he can. The FBI, all it takes is one president. And the FBI can disappear. The CIA can disappear. All these agencies can disappear. However, I don't know about these other deals since Congress came up with it. But I'm a firm believer, since they created it, they are responsible for it. Okay? And really need to start studying this notice of liability, because we need to start handing notice of liability to these agencies that Congress magically has no power over. And maybe notice of liability to each and every Congress member that's in control with these agencies, and hold them responsible for their misactions. Again, my opinion. I'm not an attorney. This is We the People News. Bye, y'all.